So welcome everybody. My name is Christina Irion and I want to welcome you to the panel that is organized by the Institute for Information Law at the University of Amsterdam, and we are a conference partner of CPDP.ai, and every year we are organizing a panel, and this year we thought that we would like to dedicate our panel to the right to research. Because in our practice, even as lawyers, but more broadly in other disciplines as well, we realize that with the increasing intermediation of all aspects of life, society, economy, that our ability to observe and conduct research and draw conclusions from that in all areas of research, not just what is happening on platform, is becoming dependent on having data rights and access to data, especially from public and private sector organizations. So this is the topic of our panel today. And I am super happy to introduce you to a really, really nicely composed panel. And I would like to start introducing you to Laurie Rosset. She is a data protection law and policy specialist. And in her work, she focuses on public-private partnerships, litigation, as well as new technologies regulation. Laurie has experience as a data protection officer of a major humanitarian organization, is now the director of a new NGO, the Data Rights, and where she is focusing on litigation and advocacy, non-profit, focused on surveillance, sustainability, and portability of data. Laurie, which of the NGO you have been the data protection officer? Do you want to reveal that?
Yes, Oxfam and Oxfam International.
So you have a lot of experience also with data in this sector. And next to Laurie is my colleague Jeff Ausloos. And Jeff Ausloos is an assistant professor at the Institute for Information Law. And he is really our Mr. Data because he is specializing in data access for researchers in his work. Jeff is also a research fellow at the Center for IT and IP Law at the University of Leuven, where he obtained his PhD, a marvelous book. If you want to know everything about the right to data subject access requests, then that's your source to turn to. His work centers around data rights, transparency, the governance of digital infrastructures, and the broader political economy in which they operate. The data rights. And together with Jeff, we have been producing a very large report that was published last year on the digital sovereignty of universities. And this report we launched and has two legs. One leg is how universities have to defend their organizational digital sovereignty in the interest of preserving academic freedom. And the other leg, that is where Jeff has been very much in the lead, is about research data access, and that's also the topic of the panel today. Next to Jeff, I'm very, very happy and pleased to introduce you to Claudine Tinsman. Claudine is not in the program, in the printed program, because the change was made after the program went into the print. But she is also from Open Data Institute, and there she is a researcher, and she works across global data initiatives and the Privacy Enhancing Technologies, PETS, research group. She recently submitted, bravo, her doctoral thesis in cybersecurity at the University of Oxford, so soon. Yeah, in which she examined how end users interact with content control features on social media platforms to prevent and mitigate content-related emotional and psychological harm. So welcome, Claudine. Thanks for joining us today. And last but not least, also a former colleague of our institute, but now sailing under a different flag, is Arman Norosian. I'm very pleased that you could join us today. He is a senior researcher at the European Centre for Algorithmic Transparency, a brand new EU body. ECAT, and there he contributes scientific and technical expertise, which he has a lot in support of policy to the European Commission on technology regulation in various contexts, including, for example, internet intermediaries and online platforms like the DSA, as well as AI. Prior to joining ECAT, Arman was, as I said, a colleague at a postdoc, right, at our institute, and he has also been working at the Technical University of Delft on cybersecurity there. And you have published widely, especially a very nice paper recently together with my other colleague, Max, about the right to research. So thank you. This is a really, really potently stocked panel. I hope you will enjoy it. We will start this panel with a short round of interventions. So each of you gets a turn. And the second half of the panel, we will, of course, involve you all. So let me start with you, Jeff, and you brought us some insights from the study, why the right to research is such a big thing and why it's not just about the DSA Article 40, but a much broader quest that is at stake here. Please.
Thanks, Christina. I have a bit of a thing in my throat, so I hope that I'll manage to push through. So yeah, thanks for the introduction. It saves me a lot of time also. So the report that I will be presenting today, are the slides? No. Are the slides coming? Okay. So the report I will be talking about today is about data access for research, and as Christina mentioned, it's part of this bigger project on digital sovereignty of the university, which was commissioned by the executive board of the University of Amsterdam. And I guess before I start, I have to admit that that makes me feel a bit uneasy because that same board has proven itself to be quite violent and non-transparent in the past few weeks or months even. I'm talking, of course, of the violent clampdowns and repressive and censorship measures that the UvA, the University of Amsterdam, has been taking to silence its own staff and students who were trying to speak up for Palestinian rights. And ironically, in light of them also commissioning a report on data access and transparency, the university board has, for example, refused to fully comply with freedom of information requests itself for over half a year now. So students across the world have bravely been calling out universities for their financial, their moral, their intellectual complicity in supporting and normalizing an apartheid regime and an ongoing genocide. And at the University of Amsterdam, but also in many other places in Europe, for months, students and staff have been trying to engage in constructive conversations with management through all of the official channels, but these efforts have been consistently stonewalled. So I'd like to echo some other colleagues here at CPDP by saying that we all have a role to play here, and I would like to invite anyone to put pressure on their institutions, their workplaces to end complicity. All right, so with that being said, of course, all of this should not detract too much from the
presentation is not loading, so they are trying to put it up. Maybe you
okay, yeah, that's not a big issue. So, of course, all of this is not to detract from the actual content of the report. I had prepared 3 slides just as a visual cue. But I think it should work without it also if it doesn't show up here. Anyway, that report was quite a massive effort. It's over 100 pages long, and it would not have been possible without the amazing help of some of my colleagues that could not be here today, in particular Arlette Mering and Doris Buys. And so the overall objective of that report. All right, so this is just the first slide. You can scan the QR code to get access to the report. The overall objective of this report was really to get a better understanding of how researchers can access data in or about digital infrastructures and what role the law has in this regard. And of course, because so much has been happening in the last few years alone, the report can actually be seen as more of a mapping exercise of data access issues on the ground. So we did quite some empirical work, surveying and interviewing researchers that have been struggling to get access to information, to data, and a mapping exercise of data access in the law. So trying to make sense of this barrage of legislation coming from EU institutions, especially in the digital agenda. Most of these frameworks have some form of data access or transparency provision in them. So in light of time, I'm not going to talk about the empirical part. Maybe later, please also check out the report if you're interested in that. I'm going to zoom in on the legal mapping work. So for that, we looked at 16 frameworks. And in those frameworks, we identified the relevant provisions, talking about transparency or data access. We mapped them across different parameters, what type of data is mentioned, what's the rationale of this provision, who's the data holder, who's the data recipient, any formalities, et cetera, et cetera. And in an attempt to structure these provisions, try to compare apples and oranges, if you will, we try to categorize them along different axes, all of these different provisions, right? So proactive versus reactive transparency, direct versus indirect access, and system-level data versus individualized data. And that sort of resulted in this table. This table with some examples from the different frameworks. More detail, again, you can find in the report. But taking a step back, there's basically three main categories, if you will, of data access and transparency provisions that we can identify across the legal landscape right now. And the first category would be provisions that allow for direct access to data for researchers. The most obvious example would be Article 40 in the DSA. Then there's a whole range of provisions that allow for data donation projects. So these are basically provisions that allow direct access to people, organizations in particular capacities, as a content creator, as a data subject, as an owner of an IoT device. And then subsequently, that data can be donated in sort of a citizen science or like a crowdsourced sort of data gathering exercise. And then thirdly, sort of like a catch-all category of provisions that sort of could be interpreted as creating an enabling environment, facilitating the sharing of data also in the context of research. And the DGA, the Data Governance Act, contains a lot of them. So of course, these are just some of the main high-level findings of the report. Obviously, there's much more detail in it. So please have a look at it. And then finally, Christina invited us all to end on a more critical note, so to trigger the discussion later. So I guess, as to my critical reflection, if you will, the starting point of the report, but also the work of many other people and panels at CPDP and elsewhere, seems to be that data access for research is generally a good thing. But what is not always made explicit is this strong normative assumption underlying these claims for researcher data access. And so that research, and especially academic or public interest-driven research, that is necessarily something to strive for. And that data access is also a vital component, supposedly, of that. And so what I'm interested in exploring a bit more is to unpack this normative assumption. So, for example, as we are pushing hard for researcher data access, what are possible risks here? Aren't we actually actively contributing to these logics of data capitalism, information capitalism, platform surveillance capitalism, you name it, capitalism? Aren't we legitimizing these problematic data practices of these digital infrastructures that we so often like to critique in the first place? I think I'll end on that cynical note and leave it to Laurie, I guess, for the next speech.
Thank you very much. Okay, let me just...
Wait a moment. They will put it on.
Okay, perfect. Then I will start. So hello, everyone. My name is Laurie. I'm very happy to be here. So here, splendid. Okay. I would like to start with saying that not all those who search are researchers. Exactly as Jeff highlighted, it's more relevant to start talking about public interest research. And so I guess this is really where I'm building on what Jeff told you, because I'm also here to talk about the work of NGOs and investigative journalists that also do research and sometimes are faced with exactly the same hurdles. So I am in the process of creating data rights, and just a word on this, the main activities of data rights include strategic litigation and building legal solutions. And one of the pillars of the programs of the organization is actually building on some research that I'm going to talk about, which is really focusing on, as Christina said, public-private partnerships, because I was really interested to really bridge that gap and figure out what was the state of accountability, because I had the feeling that sometimes public-private partnerships were seen as a way to maybe lower accountability, so I really wanted to have some serious data-supported research on this. And so this is where you have the title here, and just a word on the research itself. So in practice, it focused on the reliance on the exemption to transparency by states invoking national security. I'm saying states because if we were talking about private entities, it would be trade secrets, just to mention this. And so in terms of the research data, it mainly fed from data from Privacy International, so freedom of information requests from them, and from investigative journalists, Lighthouse reports, and others, but this is the bulk of the data. And the entities that were the focus of that data were mainly in Spain, in Italy, in the UK, and EU institutions. And I want to stress that if there are not other people, other countries, it's probably because many of these don't actually really answer requests. And so I wanted to mention three key findings of the research that are actually relevant for this panel today. So first, the apparent lack of understanding by authorities of their power on the data of individuals and therefore of their responsibilities. And secondly, their systemic breach of UN principles on access to data. And then thirdly, the overly problematic reliance on national security where it's actually probably not relevant. So I'm going to start with the lack of understanding of power and responsibilities. And just maybe to say, public-private partnerships are not new, but what is new is the reliance on personal data and the humongous amounts of personal data and the technologies used to process that data. We're talking big data, we're about to talk AI, so this is very, very humongous in terms of, also the interconnection of databases. This is really what has changed. And I think an example is really helpful. So typically the administration of the Como city in Italy has decided at some point to deploy face recognition cameras, and even though apparently the main system was garbages and migrants coming through, and interestingly, they relied on a service provider not only to roll out the entire program, but also to do the privacy impact assessment, which is exactly what the controller has to do because they have to be held accountable. So surprise, surprise, the service provider found out that it was absolutely safe to roll out the project, and even said that the Data Protection Authority had been reached, which turned out to not be the case, and at some point the authority had to actually get involved and kill the project. So interesting use of public data and probably public trust. And so this is something that I discovered as very helpful actually for researchers. So I'm going to talk about this now. So the principles of access to data when it comes to state data are really interesting because I found out that they were systemically breached. And so, well, many entities simply do not answer requests. So not much to study here, but definitely worth highlighting. When they do answer, aside from being extremely defensive, very often what is asked is actually not given. And even more problematically, they don't even explain why they don't give it, which is interesting because it actually violates the core of the principle of accountability, which is the main principle that controllers actually have in data protection law. They also don't give any information on people's rights, including the right to appeal their decision. Interesting. And then just to add, they also have the obligation to share what they already shared. And just as an anecdote, I had some data that they had shared, but I thought there was a missing document, so I thought, oh, I'm just going to do the request again. I never got the data that was already published, so that was interesting. So I think this is requiring huge resources from researchers, from NGOs, and from journalists, and I think this is in itself something that we have to be aware of. And then finally, an abusive reliance on national security in the sense that most of these organizations, entities, actually did not work on national security projects. They seemed to think that no transparency meant no accountability, which is very interesting because it's actually exactly the opposite. You have to document internally why you didn't share, and even if you have a good reason to not share, you actually have to go through a 3-steps test to figure out whether there might be actually public interest overriding reasons to share anyway. So all of this has to be documented. And then just last but not least, legal exemptions have to be the exception, not the norm. And so it's very interesting to also just take a step back and think, if these exemptions that were baked in laws are becoming the norm, the social contract is just broken. And it really struck me to realize that the only entity that actually did follow case law was the Ministry of Defense in the UK. So the only one that actually had national security reasons. So a conclusion, for me, it's really important to realize that the digitalization of our societies really cannot come with the watering down of accountability, even public or privately. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie, for this experience. National security is also very hard sometimes to get access to data, but even outside of national security, I assure you that this is hard bread to chew on. I'm wrestling with the European Commission on documents, DG Trade, and it's tense. Which brings us now to Arman. Arman, thank you for joining us. You have written this amazing paper, How to Design Data Access for Researchers, a Legal and Software Development Perspective, together with Max von Drunen. And I'm really happy that we have one who is not a lawyer on the panel, so go.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, I can hear myself. Yes, thanks a lot for inviting me to the panel. You already introduced me quite a bit in terms of what my background is. I always struggle to introduce myself because I've been jumping from field to field in academia, and now I'm flying under the banner of ECAT. Although I have to say today, look at me as the researcher. I'm not really representing the Commission here. I've only recently joined the European Centre for Algorithmic Transparency. But I want to connect to the discussions that's going on here also a bit through my own history of what I've worked on. For a long time I've been working on internet security before I started becoming interested in topics related to disinformation and other related things, which is why I ended up working at the Institute for Information Law in Amsterdam. And consequently, I ended up at ECAT. So we ended up writing this paper regarding research access, and my main contribution there was from my technical background, which is a software engineer. I have a software development background, and today I will focus a bit on, maybe take you a bit through a tour of a history of what I learned since the early 2000s when I was studying, and I want to focus a bit on this concept that you probably all have heard, at least in some way, because it's so pervasive in the software industry, in the tech industry, this concept of being agile. So this is one of the main things that We were also exposed that in the early 2000s, it was one of the hype things. Everyone was talking about how do you effectively write software that works for people, and I will connect that later why I want to focus a bit on this Agile to the broader discussion here. So in essence, it's this series of principles that started emerging in software development to discuss that if you want to make software for people that work, you have to follow a certain set of principles, be flexible, do iterative designs, get feedback from your end users, and basically develop the product in the end together with the end user of your system. So in one way, I mean, the term is in one way very interesting, because if you look at the current state of the industry, the types of products that they provide as an industry set as a whole, you will see terms like CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous delivery, or like DevOps, DevSecOps, and all these things pop up everywhere in what they do. And it even appears to some extent in lobbying efforts. So if you, I won't name specific names, but for instance, in relation to the AI Act, you would hear asks from the regulator that the AI Act needs to be agile. It needs to basically fit to basically the way that we work in some sense. So now I want to turn a bit about to, let's say, to my own experience of actually data access, of doing research using, for instance, the platform's APIs and other things. So for a while, I was doing research together with other colleagues that looked into political advertising and micro-targeting on what's going on the different platforms in this respect. And it was actually very difficult to use these APIs. It was very difficult to actually get the type of data that we needed to do the research. It was very difficult to actually answer significant research questions that were important. And so there was this element lacking. So what I want to contrast here a bit is that on the one hand, you have an industry that's talking about being agile, and on the other hand, you have an API as a researcher to work with that very much is rigid. It is not flexible at all, and I see this stark contrast between how these two things function together. So that's the main thing that I want to highlight a bit, and what I see is that in order to basically have or basically fulfill this goal that the researcher needs to provide under various regulation, and as Jeff already mentioned, there's a series of regulations that are providing some data access, basically rights for various researchers, including the DSA. But there's also, I'm not sure if everyone is aware of this, but this was something because of my research I was looking at, is this proposal for regulation on political advertising. And in there's also a similar provision for that there needs to be an ad library. And so for me, as a software engineer, it's very clear that an API and an ad library is a piece of software. And in order to basically design its functionality, and in order to basically provide what the end user needs to get out of that, you need to follow these agile principles. And so because we were asked to also end with a bit of a food for thought kind of thing, that's the thing that I wanted to mention here, is to maybe think about this as like, okay, where is this agility in the platform's approach to what the ad library needs to do and what the researcher needs to get access to that data. So that's a bit of a stark contrast to what we were talking about before. I'm saying, let's say, from the mindset of a researcher, how do you get the API and the things that you're trying to work with to meet your needs? And I think I would like to end on that for now.
So thank you for this contribution. And yes, I agree that apart from the law, you also need, of course, a technological interface that makes the researcher data access work. But now let's turn towards Claudine. And you wanted to also share with us your experience with research data and your organization's perspective on that.
Yes, so I am going to talk about something maybe a little bit different, slightly broader, So I am at the Open Data Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that works sort of across both research and advocacy around open data. And the piece that I'm going to talk about is something that my colleague, Sophia Worth, who I'm replacing, which is why you may have seen her name in the program, and I worked on over the course of about 3 months earlier this year, which has yet to be published, but should be out in the next few weeks, where essentially we had what we thought, I think quite innocently, was a fairly basic question, which was, we spent a lot of time talking about the DSA. And because of the nature of our organization, her and I have spent a lot of time looking into Article 40. And what we wanted to know is what buzz, essentially, is this particular provision of the DSA creating in the rest of the world, in other jurisdictions, in other environments, and how do other researchers, and I use that term loosely, not as in vetted researchers in the context of Article 40, how are they perceiving the DSA, and how might that affect different jurisdictions, different political economies, different specific national contexts in terms of revamping essentially data access regulation? And what are the challenges outside of the EU that researchers are currently encountering in terms of accessing data, specifically social media platform data? As I'm sure probably everybody in this room is aware, it is becoming increasingly difficult, or it has been becoming increasingly difficult to access social media platform data. And Article 40 is still sort of being worked out in terms of its practical implementations. So up until very recently, it's been getting more and more difficult to access, for example, Twitter. I know it's X, I will keep calling it Twitter. Twitter data through their API. They've put it behind a rather significant paywall. PushShift, essentially access to PushShift for Reddit was more or less revoked overnight, or very, very quickly, I should say. And so these are a number of challenges that are not only affecting the EU, they are affecting researchers in the rest of the world. So the way we went about this was because there are a number of challenges to conducting this kind of research on that scale. We took a fairly informal approach. At this stage, we're just kind of scoping things out, which is why this will be a sort of informal, fairly broad report. It will not be a piece of, for example, academic literature. We didn't feel comfortable doing that at this stage. We would need to do more, conduct more interviews and perform more research in that area. But at this stage, we conducted 11 interviews with experts both from academia and civil society, and Jeff, about the specific topic, and we wanted to get as much of a spread as we could. So we spoke to researchers based in Latin America, based in different regions of Africa, the United States, some in Europe, and tried to sort of get a little bit of a bird's eye view of the problem and try and tease out some kind of insights that we might be able to provide and use to guide further research. So without going into specifics about each individual interviews, we drew out what we thought were some fairly interesting parallels. So the first is, I think unsurprisingly, that a number of different countries have tried in the last few years, or are in the process of developing regulation around data access that is inspired by the DSA and adapted to their specific context with varying levels of progress at this stage. Brazil, for example, has the fake news bill, which has gone through several iterations and does mirror certain parts of the structure of the DSA. There's the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act in the United States, although probably should not refer to it to someone working in public data in the United States as being inspired by the DSA. Some people get very cranky about that, but it does very closely resemble the structure of Article 40 when it comes to data access for researchers. And that has sort of been stuck in committee in the Senate for a number of years. It keeps getting reintroduced, not passing, and we'll see how that sort of evolves. But there is clearly an appetite for this type of regulation in other parts of the world outside of the EU. Now, that being said, one of the things that we came across, particularly speaking to our colleagues who are based in Latin America and in Africa, is, at the risk of putting it too bluntly, that sort of regulation is kind of the least of their concerns at this point. Because the thing that they communicated to us was that, in theory, having more structure would be great. Having channels through which they could access data would be very helpful. But the problem was they were lacking the infrastructure to do that. And I mean the infrastructure on the side of on the platform side. There is very little motivation, from their point of view, for platforms to actually provide the necessary means for researchers based, for example, in Kenya, to be able to access platform data about, let's say, Kenya or about other regions of Africa, and simply do not provide any points of contact. I think the researcher we spoke to from ICT Research Africa pointed out that at the time of the interview, this may not be true anymore, but at the time of the interview, there were no points of contact at Meta for anyone in Kenya to actually interact with in order to make any kind of request for access to researcher data on an ad hoc basis. So what do? Well, they have to figure out who the nearest point of contact is, and that's usually the DPO, the Data Protection Officer, who, despite their best efforts, may not know and may not have specific information and specific knowledge about what the requirements and what the restrictions might be in the Kenyan context if it's the DPO for Meta Africa, for example. And it's a regional DPO. They're not a data access specialist in that particular context, and that is simply, though it's related to their post, it is not their specific role. So then they talked about, for example, having to then speak directly to somebody at Meta headquarters who had potentially even less knowledge about what the specific restrictions or requirements might be in that context. And it just ended up being an endless cycle of simply being unable to access the data that they needed to access. And so as a result, as a workaround, and this was true in Latin America as well, for some of the colleagues that we spoke to, that the hurdle that they had was then, essentially, that they had to, or that they felt that the best way to sort of access the data that they needed was to partner with civil society or academia based in Europe or based in the United States to access the data sets that those organizations already held. Because the alternative would be to go through data brokers that are more locally based, but often at prohibitive costs. So they relied on other organizations in Europe or in the US to do that. Which comes with its own set of problems, right? You're then having to access data that was almost certainly collected for a different purpose than the one that you were researching as the researcher in that particular context. And furthermore, there's sort of limited control over what they felt they could ask for and what they felt that partnership what they could extract from that partnership. So that's sort of all to say that I'll come to a conclusion in a minute, that there was a lot of buzz about the DSA, there was a lot of interest in the DSA, and a sort of wait-and-see approach at the moment to see exactly what some of the practical benefits and hurdles are going to be to rolling out Article 40 and to actually putting Article 40 into practice. I didn't go into it too much here, but as I'm sure you know, there is some slightly vague language in the DSA and in Article 40 specifically around how data can be accessed, what some of the implementations of that will be, the sort of process of vetting researchers and so on. And so while there's a lot of interest in that in the rest of the world, the discussion, at least for a certain number of organizations, is sort of an academic one at this stage, and that they're very much adopting a wait-and-see approach, and that it's something that they're looking to in the next few years. I think the one sort of point to sort of end on, as a more, I guess, provocative point, is a point that came up quite a bit when we spoke specifically to our colleagues in Africa, which was a discomfort with the fact that it's unclear in the DSA exactly what the reach of the data to be accessed can be. So what I mean by that is, yes, we would assume, for example, that data that pertains to, that was generated by EU citizens or residents of the EU would be in scope of data to be collected. But potentially, that data also includes user-generated data from other regions of the world. And there's this really intense discomfort about the EU or researchers in the EU being able to access data about countries, frankly, about citizens of other countries that they themselves cannot have access to. And that was a really big source of discomfort, and there was a real sense of, and a few people use this term, digital colonialism being perpetuated through the DSA that really did not sit well with a lot of the researchers that we spoke to, I think quite understandably. That's it.
So thank you for your initial statements. If I try to bundle that together, then we are already now converging on this principle that there is a right to research, which, however, doesn't always translate into a corresponding right to access data for research. We have for public sector data, we have freedom of information laws, so there is in principle a very good legal basis for accessing data. In practice, it doesn't always work so smooth as we have learned from Laurie's contribution. Jeff has walked us through that there are many legal frameworks now that recognize some sort of access to data which could potentially be used also to build on research projects. But for this you always need to have a lawyer under your arms, basically, because every legal instrument utilizes a different right, and you can access different types of data under different conditions for different research purposes. And of course, we know that we have been talking a lot about Article 40 DSA is a wonderful instrument, but it has a clear limited purpose, and it is not meant to be used as a general right to research access to data. Okay. We have also heard from Arman that agile principles in software studies are often used to make it harder for researchers to really get the data that they need, and that APIs for researcher access do not always correspond to what you really need as a researcher. And finally, we heard also, that's very good, the international dimension, that it is by no means easy to get data from platforms and in other parts of the world, but we want also other data, not just from platforms. The right to research is not just about getting data from platforms, but it is broader. However, there comes, of course, the other side of the coin. What is research? What is public interest research? What should actually benefit from any privilege in the laws to get access to data from private and public sector organizations? And what responsibility comes with it as well? Because just because somebody, like a research group at the university, or let's say a research branch of a pharmaceutical organization says, we are doing research, does that mean that all the data should be rolled out without any additional checks and safeguards attached? So in the next very brief intervention, I would like to invite you to give us some ideas what kind of principles, ethical principles, normative principles research should comply with in order to really be qualified to get this access for research purposes to data of others. And we just go down the road. Maybe you want to start and then backwards. Thank you.
I can start. It's a very difficult discussion to ask from a technical person. So I will try to walk a bit through some examples from my own experience where I think having access to data, even in sensitive data in some cases, is actually in the public interest, and what principles, for instance, in those specific cases were followed. I think it's quite important to definitely keep that in mind. I don't want to advocate here that, for instance, the platforms have to, in my example of what I focused on, that they have to give broad access to everything, but it's more like the idea was that the same set of principles that they follow in other areas should also apply here. But there are other examples from my own history of work with on the policy sphere, working with Dutch government, for instance, that I think give examples of why it is important to have this data access. And one of the very clear examples that I can directly think of is work that I did with the Dutch high-tech National Crime Police Unit. During my PhD, for instance, it was a very arduous process to get access to data about, for instance, investigations that they were doing on certain criminal companies that they had wiretapped, and then there's a very specific, for instance, and this also relates a bit to the DSA itself, because it's a hosting provider company that was hosting or allegedly hosting child sexual abuse material. But not only that, because of my internet security background, there's also malware and other types of things that were being hosted there. The sensitivity was that it's an ongoing investigation, but then the Dutch police is flexible enough in some way to also understand that through a process of getting access to data, they can allow a researcher in to understand, for instance, how a certain company behaves, which is, as far as I know, it's the first publication in this area that we published to understand the business model of a certain company that was taken down by Dutch police. And this is very much, from our point of view, very much in the public interest to understand this is how the company works and how you can actually combat it or basically create mitigations or create policy around, for instance, certain illegal content on how you can prevent this type of thing from happening again. So it's very much towards this evidence-based type of policy making that is very much needed. And that's one of the examples that I can give that I think it's really interesting to actually make the claim that this is really needed. I think that's my point.
Thank you.
Sort of building on the public interest point is, so I think in my view, there are sort of two aspects to this that are key. The first is transparency, and I mean that on both sides, both in terms of the purposes for which the data is being collected. I know there are provisions for that in the DSA, but even so, sort of potentially going above and beyond what is required there, because particularly when it comes to social media platform data, let's say, these are still, a lot of this content is user-generated. And yes, users, there is a debate to be had that users who post on, let's say, public social media accounts should have a reasonable expectation that their data will be publicly available. That does not mean that they ever necessarily expected for it to be used in the context of research or in other contexts other than posting an Instagram reel, for example. And so because of that, even for some stuff that may seem relatively innocuous, I think it is critical, it is incumbent upon researchers to be extremely transparent about the purpose of the use for that data. And also to be very clear about, I think to sort of Jeff's point earlier, about there being a kind of a hunger for data, that the data that is being collected, both the type and the quantity, is proportionate to the needs of the researcher, as opposed to just collecting as much as possible simply for the sake of collecting it. And that those, at least in my view, are fairly, I think, fairly broad principles, but I feel that they also tend to get potentially overlooked on the researcher's side. Of course, platforms should be transparent about their practices and about how they are using data, how they're processing data, but I think that also on the research side of it, that can also be overlooked, and that includes, outside of the DSA, researchers who don't necessarily fall into the vetted researchers category as defined by the DSA, such as journalists or people like me in civil society, for which there is potentially less stringent or less sort of structured ethical approval processes, right? Universities have ethical review boards. Corporate companies in civil society or journalists might have their own internal processes, but those aren't necessarily as clear or as straightforward or as, well, not straightforward, or as transparent as some university processes might be or might be required to be. And so that is also an additional component to this problem that I think should also be better handled. I have certainly seen examples in the course of my work where there isn't really an ethical review process outside of academia, and I do find that concerning, particularly where large amounts of potentially personal data is being processed.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. And building on what has been said before, I think even within academia we have a veneer of ethical review, but I think everybody remembers also Cambridge Analytica, where even at a very prestigious university, you know, like shit still hits the fan. And so, yeah, also like tying it back to the report that we did and the interviews that we did with many researchers across different faculties and data stewards, sort of this new position in many universities. Yeah, there's only so much you can do bureaucratically within your university to push researchers to be ethical. There's a lot of checklists already. I think I think, yeah, I want to make 2 points, I guess. Very much on an individual level, like a project-based level, I think apart from all the checks that are already in place and being developed, like ethic reviews, data management plans, GDPR compliance, et cetera, what I was getting at before, I think there's a strong need for more self-reflection also on why do we need data in the first place? Are there other ways? What is being invisibilized by using this data? How are we indeed, what I said before, legitimizing the data collection by the organization from whom we were demanding the data in the first place? These are questions I don't see much being asked in practice. I think there's a lot to be learned from the field of critical data studies, and my hope would be that sort of, yeah, the insights that we see there can be translated to other disciplines as well as sort of this critical self-reflexivity in projects. But also on a more like macro system level, I guess. Yeah, I also want to echo what you said, Claudine, about like more like these geopolitical dimensions. So I'm after we finish this report, I'm currently with a colleague in Tilburg editing a book on more critical perspectives on data access questions. And one of the chapters in that book is by an author from South Africa, very much also giving this critique of, you know, like you have all of these laws being put into place in the EU that sort of facilitate free flow of data, offering many opportunities for research within the EU, and also for much data to flow into the EU for being used to be used for all kinds of AI projects. But nothing can get out, right? And this creates, arguably creates like problematic neo-colonial dynamics, if you will, that need to be tackled as well. And I would say universities, maybe not on an individual researcher level, but universities or associations of universities also have a responsibility to sort of challenge policymakers in that regard.
Thank you. And what is your take on the...
Actually, that's a really useful transition because I'm not going to echo too much what you said because I felt this was covering most of the question. Typically, purpose limitation is critical. I also thought that the case law of the Court of the European Court of Human Rights is actually really interesting in terms of creating balancing tests that can be really helpful as toolkits. And so I think they can definitely help to narrow down how to look for data and figure out what is going to be useful. And I really like your point on transparency, and which is where, I guess, not being in academia, probably I can make the point, which is it's probably also very difficult for researchers to know what they can focus on if actually they don't know what's being done. And so I guess I'm going to give an example. So the Council of Barcelona chose to not answer Privacy International's requests, but instead gave a joint letter with Huawei. And the joint letter was very interesting because it said that it had possible initiatives that would span from the deployment of smart city cases to, and I quote, advanced investigation and development through supercomputing and artificial intelligence. I would also imagine that as a researcher, when you hear things like this, you think, oh dear, I have to be pretty broad because this is scary. So, interesting this.
Great. So while you are now thinking up what you would like to discuss with us or what questions you want to ask us to the panel, I want to ask you to tell me in one sentence what you would wish for from a regulatory framework for researcher data access. And this way we go down this road. So you start, please.
I think I need to think about that.
Okay, then maybe just whoever is ready. Yeah, I would very much like one single interface for researcher data access requests that you can harness in order to request data from public and private sector organizations under one single framework instead of having 20, 30 very niche and difficult ones.
I can go. I think, and this is more DSA specific, but for Article 40, I would like to see the definition of researcher. This is not going to happen, but I would like to see the definition of researcher, vetted researcher, expanded significantly because I think it does disregard or it sort of sidelines people who are not necessarily vetted researchers under Article 40 who do a lot of important work and who also need access to that data for other purposes and to produce other insights.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, if you're taking the legal route, I think also, yeah, better enforcement. I mean, that's a no-brainer. Coming from a data protection background, I think better enforcement also, like, for access rights would be useful. And with that, I would also include, indeed, like, that enforcement agencies should have, or should come through on, or like, should make use of their investigatory powers a bit more, so we get a better sense of what's happening in the first place on these platforms, because that's often the question, right? Like, what can we even ask for in the first place as researchers?
I'm happy to build on this because this was the point that I was going to make. So strengthen the enforcement to actually mend the asymmetries, and so typically one of the cases that I was studying actually reached the EU ombudsperson, and it was really also striking to realize that the ombudsperson didn't really realize that data protection rights were deserving to be protected from the side of the researchers. And so these were cases of national security. People were actually starting to fear for themselves in the interactions with Europol, and were asking data protection questions as well that were not answered, and that the ombudsperson was not even answering themselves after. And that really struck me because I thought, okay, so researchers are also feeling distress as a result, and so yeah, enforcement needs to be bulked up, I think.
And with this, the ball is with you in the audience. So I don't know, do we need a microphone? And sorry, I missed you. Oh,
No, it's
Ahmad,
okay.
I'm so sorry.
It's a difficult question to answer from my position because I'm somewhat in the position of the regulator. But I think what I would answer to that is my biggest wish is to let's say coordinate the efforts of, let's say, the research community and also the civil society organizations and also the regulator itself, because there's a huge amount of research that needs to be done, but I see it as very difficult to actually try to bring all of this together to basically create bring the evidence together to inform policy making in that direction, because that's my biggest wish, that policy making is more evidence-based in that sense. So I think that's my biggest wish, that somehow there's a coordination between all the efforts that are going on around here.
Thank you very much. This wish should come true, hopefully. So now we can turn to the audience. We would be interested to learn from you, and we have here the first. Please say who you are and who you represent. Yeah?
So, Andrew Adams from Meiji University in Tokyo. We've very much focused on the DSA, of course, but also mention of some other issues such as freedom of information. I wonder if any of you have looked at the have looked at whether there is any mileage in the UNESCO recommendation on science and scientific researchers, which, despite the name, for anyone in the audience who doesn't know, is actually a binding UN treaty. Despite the name recommendation, it's a binding UN treaty. And I'm wondering whether that could be used to reinforce access, particularly when you were talking about other countries, places in Africa, for instance, and whether that would be a mechanism for pushing for broader access, for instance, for people from civil society, because science in the UNESCO recommendation is not limited to these vetted researchers that the DSA quite reasonably defines, although I agree with you, it's too narrow, but it's reasonable for the DSA as a very specific law to define that. But I think the UN recommendation might be a way that you could push for broader access in that way. I don't know if any of you have looked at that, or whether you have any thoughts about whether that would be a useful route to expand in the ways you think it should be expanded.
Thank you. Is anybody interested with this particular work of the UNESCO? Is it still ongoing?
It is an existing treaty.
It's there.
I mean, UNESCO is continuing to monitor, and there is an ongoing reporting of the implementation of that that UNESCO is undertaking. That they have I think it's a 2-year cycle of reports on the implementation of this, right? So there is a mechanism for an ongoing effort in this area.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for raising that point. I haven't looked at that in particular in the report, which was very much focused on Europe. But I see two main issues. The issue of enforcement, of course. It's nice to have these principles, but and also like what I think many people here also have raised is that the problem is not necessarily a legal problem, right? It's not for a lack of legal provisions. It's more like a political economy, technical question. Yeah.
Yeah, but a very good point, and I will definitely look it up. We have a question. Oh, yes.
Yeah, I'd like to mirror a bit what we are saying here as well. It's I think one of the questions that basically all these laws have transformed, especially with respect to the DSA, what I think is the question from a technical standpoint has transformed from do I have the right to get access to data to how do I get access to data? And I think that's the key point to try to at least to focus on a bit, especially when I bring up, for instance, that point about being agile and getting access to, for instance, data from the libraries. It's more like, does the researcher, or is the researcher capable of even answering their own research question, and is basically the processes that before it was, no, you don't get access to this type of data. Now, yes, you get it, but okay, is this data really useful or not? So I think the question is a bit transformed in that sense. That's what I like that.
Yeah, that's a good observation as well. How? Now we have a question in the back.
Yeah, not so much a question, more a contribution. First of all, let me applaud you to this excellent panel. I'm very happy to see that you approaching this topic, and I only now realize that I probably should have offered a workshop. My name is Jan Schallerberg. I used to be working for a DPA in research a long time ago, and now I went into private practice, and we do support researchers a lot in accessing data and helping them with getting the contracts right. We just recently did a huge work on data repositories, and we formulated template contracts for inbound and outbound, which just addresses one aspect of those many aspects that you've been raising. But I thought it might be an interesting starting point. What we did is we did empirical research within the German research community of social sciences. We took all their contracts they already had, put them underneath each other, sorted those 1,300 clauses,
Wow.
and then condensed it into a contract that we believe now should work, but we are aware that this is just a starting point, and it could be an interesting starting point also because we also have a huge list of, say, technical organizational measures that are typically applied in those fields, and what you usually do is you pre-configure for certain circumstances depending on the sensitivity of the data, and that could be an interesting starting point, not only in contractual situations, but also for developing a code of conduct or good practices. And when we finished that work, we didn't follow up what we started. We said it would be very interesting to kind of get into a greater community discourse beyond just the German discussion, and to develop a kind of common set of clauses across Europe, ideally. And that would help a lot, I believe, also in the context of these different types of accesses that Jeff just mentioned, because often there are provisions in those access rights where it says, well, you have to give certain guarantees. And here you go, you have a whole list of guarantees that you could just take off, and you'd also have to implement, of course, right? So if you're interested in that work, I'm here. Please feel free to approach me. I'm happy to connect.
Excellent. Is that a public resource, and is it in English?
Yeah, we have just recently made an English translation as well of those two contracts. It's a public resource. It's published with the Deutsches Zentrum für Hochschulwissenschaft. I'll be happy to spread it. I can't put it on the screen right now, but yeah, you'll probably be able to find it as under the notion of DZHW, and then you would look into a contract template for data repositories. I think the project it was under is called Consortium KONSORT. That's probably the Google term that you want to put in. KONSORT SWD. That was the project name. We all know these projects.
Thank you.
Right?
Awesome. That's really good. Something to start. We have a question from Adam. Here, the gentleman on the aisle.
Thank you. My name is Adam Födes. I work at Transparency International. In the university research field, you can see a trend that those researches that are financed by public funds are more easily accessible for the public, so the outcomes of the research, but also data sets. Do you see any similar trend in the public sector? Because it has been quite business-like, the European Union's approach that if you want a data set, we can sell it to you, and that's it, regardless whether the data set was created with public funds or not. So I mean the PSI directive or the successor of the PSI directive. So do you see any trend in this direction or any hope in this direction?
Do you want to answer? I'm the moderator. I don't have to.
Yeah, I see a trend that it's becoming more open, at least in theory. That seems to be the intention of the regulator. If that's your question. I can't really hear. The intention seems to be to make it more open and not like not like.
Giving it for free.
Yeah.
You mean free that already public funds are into these.
Yeah, I mean that's. So, okay, I'm not sure I'm qualified to talk about that. I really look more at the position of researchers trying to access data, and then I feel there are many options to do that for free. But of course, if you look at the DMA and stuff, there's many like also, I guess, structures being set up to facilitate data sharing in exchange for money. Yeah.
The legal framework under the PSI directive and also the Data Governance Act requires that public sector data should be made available, but that under conditions that are fair, reasonable, accessible, and non-discriminatory. And this also applies to the costs if such a data set is made available. Now, here researchers actually have a little bit an advantage, because for us there should be an effort to make it available without charge when it is in public interest research. That would also probably apply to public interest research that is not strictly scientific research, so broader than that. But when you try to access data for commercial purposes, which is perfectly available as well, then a fee can be levied, but this should not be, that should be a reasonable fee that is really like cost-based and not like making a revenue. So in a way, I think the rules are clear, and I think they are also just and fair. For the rules, in practice, I don't have insights. Do we have more questions? Who was next? I'm losing a little. Yeah, would you like to go next? Yes, you?
Hi, my name is Aditya. I'm from the University of Edinburgh. My question is actually about this, maybe reformulating this, formulation of the right to research, because I really liked these provocations about, what is research, who is a researcher, and kind of challenging the idea of research as a self-evidently good thing. From the global justice angle, I was reminded of how universities, for example, in the UK or Europe, were very much part of the colonial project. So, research can do a lot of things. And there was this idea, I'm noticing two different kinds of research being bundled here and talked about, research that goes upwards, I guess, researching power, researching institutions that have control over us, and then sort of researching downwards, which has those sort of extractive elements. So I think, so I guess I'm thinking about if there are sort of ways we can formulate this, I mean, I think it's a provocative formulation, the right to research, but I'm thinking if there's ways we can frame it differently maybe, or with some more reflection and nuance.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Do we have comments from the panel?
I like the framing. I have to think about it a bit.
So the right to research upwards maybe is something we can agree about. For me, the right. Maybe I should also disclose that I'm on the ethics board from my faculty. So mostly we are lawyers, right? Lawyers have not often heavy empirical projects. So in a way, it's a not so difficult position to have. But when we have data collections and stuff, we are basically checking if that is in line with ethical principles. And there's one interesting thing, like the GDPR has a little pocket for using personal data for scientific research, and this is sometimes interpreted that whatever you want to do, if it's scientific research, you should be allowed to do it. And from an ethical point of view, research ethics, I'm still insisting always to say, if you can ask people for their consent to participate in the research, then you should really do that. You cannot just use your right to research and ignore individuals and cultures and traditions and so on. So this is something we are looking out for from an ethical angle, not data compliance, data protection compliance, but from an ethical angle. What can we expect researchers to do in order to carry out a research project ethically? And I would wish me much more of this type of thinking about if you want such a privilege, like right to access data for your research, you should also really strive for making this in a way that respects, so that, for example, research downwards, as you frame it, is not downwards, but is fair and respects also the data subjects and the participants.
Yeah, if I can just follow up on that, which is that also having been recently finished up my time at a UK university, certainly coming from a PhD student, I've never been a faculty member, so I can't really speak to that, but something that has struck me from personal experience is, especially working on social media research, is the grappling with the definition of what constitutes public data and what is public, what should be public, and what we can define as public, right? There's a reasonable expectation. I came across this a number of times, and it was raised, and there were sort of questions raised, I think quite reasonably, by the Ethical Review Board about, for example, if somebody posts, if somebody posts on a subreddit about a particularly sensitive topic, say sexual assault, if it's a public subreddit, is that considered public data? Should we treat it as public? Or should we take any extraordinary steps to anonymize and de-identify data? Users already have usernames, but you can also trace, for example, in the context of Reddit, you can also trace that user's posting and commenting history. So is it really anonymous? Is it really de-identified? Should we take extra steps to deal with that? And what were the expectations of the users in that context? And I think it's a completely reasonable thing to address and to think about in the context of academic research, particularly in the context of a university. But there seems to be, at least across different review boards, there is a lack of consistency and there's a lack of clarity in terms of how those questions are treated. And it can become increasingly difficult to navigate. And I've certainly seen a number of people kind of veer away increasingly, especially after the API apocalypse, increasingly veer away from doing that kind of research because there was just a practical question of, is this going to take 3 weeks for the Ethical Review Board to look at, or is it going to take 6 months because there's a lot of internal debate? And so from a practical perspective, a lot of researchers are just veering away from it because they have no clarity and no transparency about where those guidelines are, because it seems to very much be a question that's currently in flux.
Yeah, that's right, that's right. We have, now we are almost at the end of the panel, and you have still a question, so for this we have time. And
Hello. Yes, Farid Masouli, Radboud University. Maybe it's a bit out of scope, a meta question, but ties in with what you were saying. Basically, I mean, about the sense of research. I work on the health data space regulation, and there's a secondary use of data for policymaking, research, including innovation. So it's to get your impressions. I don't really have a question, but what does it mean for you? And also in terms of like the discredit that it could put on research in general, because that, I mean, I'm focusing, I mean, Jeff, you mentioned political economy. So that's the things I'm interested in. What do you think about that?
So I must say,
I'm happy to start with a very small comment in relation with Arman's point, which is it's interesting to hear all this discourse around innovation and free flow of data, and then you think that actually it's free flow towards companies, but not outside. So is that really free flow? Oh.
Any other last observations to respond to this open question? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we discussed this already. We discussed this already to some extent. That when it comes to research, I don't inherently find research. I mean, research has to have a purpose. It's typically in the context where I think about it is to inform policy. But when we talk about in the context of the DSA and other things, so we seem to definitely have this. And I think everyone here on the panel is rightly pointing to this, that it's contributing to this sort of data-hungry economies that are really looking for this. And I think if we can't stop that and go in that direction, there at least has to be some kind of a counterbalance. So at least looking at what's happening there in order to inform policy, in order to guide policy, or basically think of other solutions. So in that sense, I think I would think of research and right to data more in those contexts or in that framing in order to think about what can we do about things. Do we see the world going in the directions that we like going in? That's what I think about, yeah.
And that means our time's up, in fact. And I want to thank you all very, very much for your insightful contributions. We continue and hang out a little bit longer here on the table if you want to still talk with us. Thank you.